I'm Aryeh Nair. I'm president of the Open Society Institute, and I'm very glad to welcome you here this evening. I have to warn you at the outset that this meeting is being webcast, and therefore your participation in it constitutes your permission to broadcast your voice if you choose to speak up during the course of this evening. We have 4 panelists with us this evening. I'm going to call first on my colleague Akwe Amosu, who is the senior political analyst for Africa in the Washington office of the Open Society Institute, and a longtime BBC journalist in Africa. And I'm going to call on Akwe to give us some political context. And then I'm going to call on those who are directly engaged in this report. Dr. Alan Keller is the founder and the director of the Bellevue NYU Program for survivors of torture. In addition to serving as a primary care physician for patients in the program, he is well regarded as an expert in the evaluation and treatment of torture victims, and has published extensively on this issue. I think I first encountered him a good many years ago when he was working on treatment of torture victims in Cambodia, and he's been at it ever since. And also sitting to his right is Dr. Samantha Stewart, who is an attending psychiatrist at the Bellevue NYU Program for survivors of torture. And then on my left is Otto Saki. He is a Zimbabwean lawyer, and he was formerly the acting director of Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. And he is currently a human rights fellow at Columbia University. So Akwe, if you would just give us something of the context in which we can discuss the matters we're considering this evening. I should say, perhaps in introducing everybody, that it's I think a somewhat auspicious occasion to hold this panel this evening, because it is the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted on December 10, 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly, and that was supposed to be the sign that the nations of the world had agreed to stop the kind of behavior that we're going to be talking about this evening. Anyway, Akwe.
Thank you, Aryeh. The crisis in Zimbabwe is a kind of front line for Africa, in my view. It may not always seem like it, but the continent has made huge strides in the past decade. We've got new institutions, new protocols that uphold human rights, a whole new civil society movement that acts to try and enforce those human rights protocols and democracy standards. So, fewer conflicts, fewer authoritarian governments, more elections, more growth. But Zimbabwe sticks out as the worst example in a shrinking group, I should say, of authoritarian governments. And it seems to me that what we need to know is, will the new Africa stand up over what is happening in Zimbabwe? And we have to ask that question because what has been striking to date has been the amount of doubt about speaking out and the silence in Africa, with some honorable exceptions. It's puzzling in its own terms because many who have spoken out strongly about human rights abuses in other parts of the world have not done so when it came to Zimbabwe. And there's a lot of work, I think, to be done to try and convince Africans in all walks of life to think beyond the old categories of colonizer and colonized and accept that the government of Zimbabwe, the government of Robert Mugabe, is the author of the crisis in Zimbabwe. But African reluctance to condemn has been particularly damaging, I think, because it's deterred others, particularly non-Africans, from speaking out. And I want to refer in particular to the failure to speak out by African leaders. For people who were activists in the anti-apartheid movement, it's very painful to see those for whom torture was a reality in their own and their comrades' lives now turning away rather than condemning the kind of abuse that we've been seeing in Zimbabwe in recent months. Since the crackdown in March, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of Zimbabweans illegitimately detained, suffering brutal violence with impunity, sometimes in full view of the public, followed by further persecution, denial of access to medical care and legal remedy. And yet there's been virtually no direct reference to these abuses by any African political leader. Officials in Southern Africa say they're engaged in trying to address the Zimbabwe problem, by which they mean a SADC-sponsored mediation, SADC being the Southern African Development Community. But the mediation is really about politics. It's the parties who are involved are opposing political parties, and the negotiation is primarily about the extent to which political power will be shared. It's not about ending the daily abuse of human rights. The African governments and opinion formers don't want to condemn Zimbabwe's government or demand more pressure from President Mbeki because of politics, the politics of being in the president's club, or of towing the collective regional line, or of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. But what this report that we're launching today is about is not politics. It registers above and beyond the political sphere. And nor is it about identity. Africans are human beings, just like other human beings around the world, and we insist on the same rights as other human beings. We don't want a different standard because we are African. In his mediation, President Mbeki has restricted participation to politicians and kept other constituencies away. And this is undoubtedly because those other constituencies want something more fundamental and far-reaching than a slice of the political pie. They want those human rights: freedom of expression and association, respect for the rule of law, protection from state-sponsored violence, independent courts, and an end to torture. And if those demands are to be advanced, African leaders and officials in Southern Africa, but also across the continent, must stand up for universal principles and ignore the conventions of solidarity among leaders. They need to abandon the notion that an African leader who once stood up to colonialism is forever afterwards beyond criticism. The definition and severity of human rights abuse is not subject to politics. It takes precedence over politics. Every person, whether African, European, American, or Asian, has a duty to denounce torture and to try to end it. We mustn't be trapped in the games of exclusion that the government of Zimbabwe has played, in which we are not allowed to criticize because we are somehow outside the continent, or because we are not Zimbabwean, because we are not African. Every criticism of torture is legitimate. Every critic has a right to speak out. I said torture and abuse transcended politics, but of course the grim reality is that the abuse is ultimately designed to affect political outcomes. The ZANU-PF government is trying to ensure that ordinary citizens learn not to express their views or challenge the status quo. The ruling party wants the field left clear so that it faces no opposition for the election next year. But no election can be free or fair on those terms. And I think we all need to bear that in mind as we go through the coming months and hear from the mediator and from the community of nations around Zimbabwe, it's all right now, we can have an election, both sides have agreed, if we get to that point, and I think that the jury is still out on that. Mainly, I want to say that the courage of Zimbabweans who continue to assert and defend their rights and refuse torture is a real beacon in a struggle that's being fought all over the world, including, of course, right here in the United States. That courage is in this room. It's expressed by the brave people who spoke to the authors of this report, and we have to do everything we can to ensure that it's not in vain. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Alan Keller.
Thank you. Thank you, Aryeh, for those kind words. Thank you for these years serving to me as a model of integrity, persistence, and tenacity in speaking out for what is right and against what is wrong. I'm extraordinarily grateful to the Open Society Institute and my dear colleagues here, including Akwe, Julie Hayes, Jonathan Cohen, our colleagues at OSISA, including Delme Cupido, and our dear colleagues and friends at Solidarity Peace Trust, an extraordinary NGO in South Africa, without whom this report, our journey to Zimbabwe, and the interviews we conducted would not have been possible. It's with humility that I share the podium with Otto Saki, who to me really speaks to the true meaning of courage. In doing this report, I had the opportunity to speak with and work with him, as well as another dear friend and colleague, Dr. Douglas Gwadzidzo, president of Zimbabwean Association of Doctors for Human Rights, who literally every day, with every breath that they take, are putting themselves on the line and are really doing extraordinary work. And then to my dear friend and colleague, Samantha Stewart, who saw through this work that we conducted and the completion of the report. So I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation. I'll just premise this, that my beautiful wife, Susie, who does work with victims of domestic violence, often has said to me that there's a key difference between doctors and attorneys, and that's doctors really can't speak without PowerPoint presentations, and I wouldn't want to prove her wrong. So there's something of that, but I also think there's a power in some of the images that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. And we're going to be talking about the report being launched now. We have Degrees in Violence, a report on torture and human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. The title, We Have Degrees in Violence, comes from a quote by President Robert Mugabe, where he was describing what they could and would do to those who spoke out against them. It was at the time the quote was made, it was in the context of, I believe, a strike by trade union workers. And he does, at least with regards to this, speak with truth that while the Zimbabwean government may have profound shortcomings in terms of capacity of meeting the basic needs of their citizens, they have horrific expertise in a level of brutality, of cruelty, of inflicting torture that in my more than 15 years of experience in evaluating and caring for victims of torture is truly second to none. So when we did this report, it's in the context of a country that has a horrific history, long history of human rights abuses, and that our visit, which took place in April and May of this past year, came following a brutal repression after a protest held on March 11th. Actually, it was a peaceful prayer rally and subsequent violence that happened that day and afterwards. Now, violence is clearly nothing new to Zimbabwe, nor is torture. But in our visit in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, which included interviews with individuals who were victims of torture and political violence, 24 such individuals, as well as more than 30 key informants from all facets of civil society, the sense that we got was that there was something even more horrific about what was happening now. And that lied in the fact that what was going on was clearly methodical and was going after all elements of civil society. That in the wake of March 11th, there was a lot of attention played to prominent members of the Zimbabwean opposition, members of the MDC party, the Movement for Democratic Change, and their leaders. But what we found was that there was a clear and methodical effort to torture, harass, intimidate, and silence any and all individuals that were seen as threats to the ruling party. And so in our interviews, we evaluated, and when I say evaluated, we went there as physicians, as individuals with expertise in documenting the physical and the psychological scars of torture, and we found tragically much to document. But those individuals that we interviewed came from all elements of society, and so that this was not just one targeting the leaders, but was from members of parliament to grassroots community organizers and anyone who was even daring to speak out against the ruling authorities. And this is of particular concern right now, given the elections that are expected to occur in the months to come. And so our findings were several fold. First of all, in addition to individuals from all elements of civil society being targeted for torture, we found that those individuals also being singled out for harassment were the doctors and the lawyers who were working to protect and care for those victims of torture and political violence. We documented clear, concerted efforts to obstruct access to legal representation, to medical care, and that we found that those individuals whom we evaluated had devastating physical and psychological scars as a result of the abuse that they had experienced. We also interviewed many individuals who had fled to South Africa because of the persecution they encountered, and we found that they were experiencing profound difficulties in accessing health services there, in obtaining a semblance of safety and security that they would not be returned to their torturers. So, I want to just share with you some of the stories of the individuals that we spoke to in the videotape that you heard. Those were the comments from a quote from Sakai Holland, a prominent leader of the opposition in Zimbabwe, who had been brutally tortured. And when we interviewed, she said the following to me. So we were made to lie down in an L shape. There were about 60 of us, and the militia started to beat us. There was one woman with boots who was jumping on us. She made a hole on me which required plastic surgery. She was calling us prostitutes of Tony Blair. Subsequently, Ms. Holland required medical evacuation to South Africa to treat broken bones throughout her body, and had clear both physical and psychological signs of the trauma that she had experienced. And the point was made by Bella, which was one that we found, that far from being immune, women, in fact, are likely being singled out for torture and persecution, those women daring to speak out against these authorities. So on one level, you have Sakai Holland, a prominent leader of the MDC party, and then we have here the back of a young woman that Dr. Stewart and I examined, whom I'll refer to as CJ, who is involved at a very grassroots level in politics, and as a result of that was arrested on March 11th. And following her arrest, she told us the following, quote, "I was hit all over the body. I was lying down on the ground. They would beat you harder if you cried out. I was beaten with iron bars and with open hands. You can see in the images here, there are markings on her back, clear imprints from the weapons of abuse that she endured. Dr. Stewart, in a few moments, will talk about the psychological impact that this had on CJ, as well as others that we evaluated. In addition, and I want to just acknowledge these images are very disturbing, but tragically do tell the horrific story that needs to be documented and needs to be told. This is her leg. As a result of being imprisoned under really filthy conditions in a feces, urine-ridden cell without access to medical care, and in fact, with the willful efforts to delay medical care, CJ developed infections on her legs from the beatings that she had suffered, which festered and which subsequently poorly healed. And she continues to bear these physical and psychological scars. It's important to note that among the perpetrators of abuse that we documented, while the police were clearly prominent, there were many others, paramilitary groups, different intelligence organizations, different groups associated with the government. And this is the back of one such individual who was stopped at a roadblock, turned over to one of these, one such paramilitary group known as the ZANU PF Youth, who severely beat him with whips, with iron bars. He described the following: they started assaulting me one by one. They were using sjamboks, which is a kind of whip, iron bars and sticks. And at times they were using their fists, saying, "You've got to tell us what are the MDC structures. If we can beat Morgan Tsvangirai, that's the president of the MDC, why can't we beat you? You must go and show us where the others live." So many of those comments, and we heard this over and over from the individuals that we interviewed, was that, they were being told that, we're doing this to set an example, to show you that you and others who would speak out against us won't be allowed to, and in fact, before the elections occur, none of you will be left. So clearly, from a medical and a forensic perspective, you can see the multiple scars on his back, all of which are very similar in their width, so clearly made by the same object and highly consistent with his reports of abuse. This is the arm of a young gentleman who, following the death of Gift Tandari, a prominent MDC activist who was shot to death at that prayer rally. He was unarmed at the time. So this individual was attending a funeral gathering outside the home of Gift Tandari, and the Zimbabwean police arrived and randomly began shooting into the crowd, shooting this young man in the arm, shattering bones in his arm, requiring surgery, and still leaving him with profound residual weakness and impairment in that arm, which likely he will have for the rest of his life. This is the head of an individual who was also initially arrested by police and then was handed over to MDC paramilitary groups, was brutally beaten all over his body, including on his head, and suffered this significant wound there. Fearing for his life, and this was very common as well, he chose to, he had no choice. He fled to South Africa, as did many of the individuals we cared for. And among the individuals whom we interviewed who had fled to South Africa, they faced profound difficulties in obtaining legal status, in obtaining any kind of identification, and so lived in constant fear of being deported back to Zimbabwe, likely back to his death. Many of the individuals that we interviewed, and we interviewed them in under very discrete and private circumstances, continue to this day, in fact, to remain in hiding, literally fearing for their lives and fearing for the safety of their families. This young gentleman, in addition to the difficulties and the trauma he endured while in South Africa, was unable to access medical care because he does not have political asylum, and the asylum process in South Africa is one that is overwhelmed and is backlogged, and if things continue as they are, it can expect to become even more so as individuals flee the violence and persecution in Zimbabwe. But because he did not have legal status, he was not able to access medical care that he needed, clearly in need of a skin graft for this wound, but was told, well, when you have asylum status or when you have enough money to pay for the operation, then come back and see us. So from him and many others, we heard these horrific stories of abuse. We heard of horrible, inhuman conditions under which they were detained. We also heard stories of harassment of those medical and legal health professionals who would seek to assist them. And then we also learned of profound difficulties that those who had fled to South Africa experienced. I'll turn the floor over now to my colleague, Dr. Stewart, to talk about some of the psychological implications of this. You could turn the slides off for a moment.
We wanted to take a couple of minutes to specifically talk about the psychological impact of torture in general, and then specifically during our travels in Zimbabwe and South Africa. One, because we think this is a topic that's often overlooked, but secondly, because it was very prevalent and we believed having a significant impact both at an individual level and possibly a little bit more complicated to convey at a social level. The first statement we'd want to make is that torture clearly has psychological impact. There's evidence out there that there's increased rates of PTSD, increased rates of depression, increased rates of substance use, increased rates of somatic problems such as chronic headaches, body pain, dizziness. And so sometimes in the short term, we see photographs and you can see the immediate consequences, but our experience through our program and early indicators during our interviews are that some of the longer term consequences are going to be these psychological impacts. The WHO is beginning to get a sense of this as well, as they're starting to figure out that a lot of the causes of disability and decreased functioning internationally are in fact depression and anxiety related disease, common mental disorders. So among those that we interviewed, we had three strategies for assessing for psychological impact. One was the standard clinical interview. The second were we used some screening tools, one called the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire and the other the Hopkins Symptom Checklist. And we didn't use those with all of those. And then third, we had, I would say, the anecdotal qualitative experience of speaking both with individuals who had been victims of torture, but also many people in various walks of Zimbabwean society who describe what's the impact of living in these conditions. So in the clinical interviews, it probably didn't take a psychiatrist to see that these people were distressed. Many of them had been victims of torture in the weeks before we met with them, and so how a psychiatrist distinguishes between what is a normal response to an obviously stressful situation and an abnormal response is talking about interference with function. When you would sit with these people, 100% of them would tell you that they were distressed and sad and scared, and they didn't have trouble describing this to you. You would also be able to see it by looking at them because they had avoidant eye contact, tapping their feet, weeping openly, and then describing symptoms that are commonly associated with depression and anxiety, inability to sleep, nightmares, flashbacks of events that had happened, and then more generalized fearfulness that they self-reported led to a decreased ability to go out into the community and find help and describe what had happened to them and contact family members for support, or even present to healthcare professionals in order to get help for their sort of more obvious physical problems. So that was fairly straightforward to say, okay, here's some people who are under distress, and we see that it's having an impact on them. They, if you can't sleep at night, if you can't eat, your physical health deteriorates, you don't feel good. What we started to notice in a more anecdotal, that the checklist didn't pick up as well, was how it was influencing their ability to communicate with other people, access appropriate care, and continue with the activism that they believed in deeply and profoundly. One of the specific cases that I thought demonstrated it particularly well was an 18-year-old young man who worked at a shop that was owned by somebody involved in opposition politics, but he worked at the shop. He was closing up the shop at night with other people. He's security after hours, and one uniformed group came by, asked them, "What are you guys doing here? Why are you involved in MDC politics?" and proceeded to beat all four of the sort of 17 to 20-year-old, basically it sounded like a 7-Eleven kind of shop, these kids there. The daytime workers fled with their injuries apparently to their homes, because once they congregated among each other, they said, you can't go to the hospital, because if you go to the hospital and you don't have a police report, they'll think that you've done something wrong. And so they all fled to their home, and he stayed to do his job that night at the security office, then disappeared for the next week until somebody from work started trying to track him down because they realized he hadn't been back to work. He reported that he had done nothing but stay locked in his apartment for the next week. He hadn't contacted friends or family. He had a broken hand and a broken ankle, and when we saw him, he was dirty, disheveled, had not told the story to anyone yet, and at the very end of the story said, that actually felt good to tell that, but I'm too afraid to tell anyone, and then went into sort of a, what should I do, what should I do, what should I do? So you also got to see this cognitive not being able to think through the situation, which is a common depressed anxiety panic response. So it had interfered with standard health care, that you need to see a doctor when you have broken bones, but it had also interfered with what would be the natural healing process when somebody's exposed to trauma or stressful situations, where you speak to somebody, call your family, tell your story. All of those natural processes that help an individual get better were disrupted under these conditions. The slightly more complicated thing that we try to touch on in the report, that I think the individual stories helped us understand, but also the stories of the members of civil society spoke to, was that if the DSM, which is our psychiatric diagnostic manual, says that, okay, you can have these symptoms if you're under stress and you don't get a diagnosis unless they interfere with function, I think people were reporting ways in which Zimbabwean society was unable to function. And I think our first call to arrive there came as a result of Dr. Gwatidzo's report saying, we've got a hospital and we've got a doctor in the hospital, and the doctor is there and the patient comes in, but policemen are surrounding the doctor while he tries to do his job, and so the young doctor gets scared and does a cursory examination. The guy's sent back to the jail cell and then passes out because he didn't get appropriate medical care. So in that, what we want to try and put together is that the psychological impact, there's disrupted function that's happening at the top-down social level as well. So if you imagine, here's a young guy who's afraid to go to the hospital because what Dr. Gwatidzo assured us is misinformation that's distributed among a fearful society, that if you go to the hospital, you're required to have a police report, which is frankly not true, but many of the people we spoke to said this is what's going to happen if you go to the hospital, combined with, you happen to have a young doctor there that night who has to do an exam with police surrounding him, and nobody is able to function in their roles that allow them to work together, keep things rolling, and to tell accurate stories which empower people and combat the dehumanization and the shameful the sort of horrible settings that the torture creates. So that's a slightly more complicated point. I want to see if I forgot anything important. So anyway, it does seem, intentional or not, Zimbabwean style torture is actually being done in a way that probably increases the psychological impact. When the way Dr. Keller was speaking of, when you have the jail conditions are bad, it increases the sense of shame. When you have people being moved from jail to jail and overhearing the police lying to the lawyers that the person is not in the jail cell, the person believes, I may die, which is one of the fundamental elements of getting post-traumatic stress disorder, that fear that you are actually going to be killed. And then this delay in accessing care so that somebody doesn't actually get to tell their story, again, increases the level of psychological distress and the burden on an individual and the likelihood that they're not going to be able to continue participating in these activities that they believe in. And so we do believe that, in fact, that the current style of torture is set up in a way that's particularly effective for interfering with people going about their business, voting, participating in elections, discussing options, discussing their beliefs, and also working to come together and heal over these problematic social issues that extend beyond the torture. So.
Thank you. I think listening to Dr. Keller and listening to Dr. Stewart, one gets an unusual insight into the debilitating consequences for an entire society of the practices that have been engaged in Zimbabwe. Otto Saki, you're somebody who has lived with these things in Zimbabwe and tried to deal with them as a human rights lawyer, and so we'd like to hear from you.
Thanks, Ari. It's an honor and a humbling experience to share a platform with so many of you. I was just going through some of the historical records about Zimbabwe, and I came across one of the most interesting quotations. This was said by then a Minister of Justice, who is currently a Member of Parliament and also currently a Minister for Rural and Social Amenities, whatever that is. He said then, in 1983, "Blessed are they who follow the path of the government laws, for their days on earth shall be increased. But woe to those who choose the path of collaboration with dissidents, for we will certainly shorten their stay on earth." This is 1983. For those of you who might have a history of Zimbabwe, during that period, over 20,000 people were killed in Matebeleland, what was called the Gukurahundi. And nothing has really been done in respect of that. So we have a culture of impunity, we have a history of violence, we have individuals and leadership who have openly professed that they have degrees in violence, such as the title of this book. What I wanted to just, I think, do is to add on to what Akwet said and also put a little bit of context on what the two doctors have just highlighted. Currently, Zimbabwe is one of the countries with the highest inflation in the world. You might have heard about it. Statistics say that it's over 15,000. That is the unofficial, but likely the official is it way. Over 2 million Zimbabweans are believed to have left the country within the past few years, mainly in South Africa, Botswana, and as far as the United States here. We have 1.6 million orphans. That's the highest in the world, and it's equally shocking. Life expectancy has fallen in the last few years, with 35, I think, being the highest for men, and 33 for women. This, I think, just gives you a picture of what the scenario is. Presently, there are no basic commodities in the shops. They're not available because of the government economic policies. You don't have any supply of clean water within the urban setting, the capital city itself. You don't have power settings or electricity, as it were. If you then take it in the context of someone who have a survivor, or rather say survivors of torture, because listening to the stories of the particular individuals, having worked with them on the 11th of March, I actually feel that they really have survived, what happened to them. They then find themselves in a scenario where they are being admitted into a hospital which has got very few doctors. The few doctors who are willing to help you are operating or working under very severe conditions, where the police are actually armed for that matter. They will not just be standing there, but they will be armed with automatic rifles. Sekai Holland, who was shown just a few minutes ago, she was in hospital with another colleague of hers, Grace Quinji, and sitting at the bed, at the end of the bed, were two armed police officers with automatic rifles. So there you are, you're trying to heal yourself, but the same person, he might not be the exact person, but the persons who are actually perpetrating and beat you up are waiting for you to recover, assuming you recover in that instance. Let's take it to the legal fraternity. Lawyers have not been equally spared, and I'm very encouraged by the fact that so many of the lawyers who have taken up these human rights related issues are very young lawyers. The organization that I work with, there are about 10 of us, fairly in our 20s, very dedicated and very committed to this cause. But they also find themselves in very difficult situations. One of the cases which might not have been reported was of a colleague of mine called Tafadzwa Mugabe, no relation whatsoever to the current president, just coincidence of the surname. His mother had been a serving police officer for 27 years in the Zimbabwe Republic Police. She was just one of the field police officers. She was given 24 hours to vacate a police house that she was living. She was dismissed without any benefits for the 27 years. What was her crime? Because her son was representing opposition activists. She recently suffered a stroke because their only source of income now becomes the son who is working. Two of other prominent lawyers had their wives receiving telephone calls, from individuals who were threatening them to say, look, your husbands should stop what they are doing. And from that, personally, I've chose not even to come with my family at forums. This is the first forum that they have publicly appeared. Even back home, I don't always appear with them because you just then think about what it does to expose them. We have had instances where on the 11th of March, and from the 11th of March to the 14th of March, we filed about 4 High Court applications. These were like urgent High Court applications. One, we're seeking access to our clients. As already been stated, you attend to a client who says, look, I'm being held at Harare Central Police Station. You present yourself to the officer in charge, inform them the reason why you're there, and only to be told that, look, we don't have anyone by that name, despite the fact that you can actually hear them, crying, or some actually calling out, or even out in the open where they used to sleep. 4 High Court orders, all of them were ignored, were defied, blatantly. In one instance, one of the lawyers had gone there to serve a court order. It was, thrown into a paper ball. So he gave this assistant commissioner, Msarashana Mabunda, I think is mentioned in the report, say, look, I'm serving you with a court order. The court says that I should have access to my clients, and also they should be, given access to medical practitioners, food, etc. And you took that court order, turned into a paper ball, and threw it right back into the face of the lawyer. And then says, the next time that I see you here, I'm going to have you arrested. Prior to that, they'd conducted a thorough search saying that he was carrying weapons of mass destruction. Whoever came up with that, I think did a very bad job for us. He was thoroughly searched. They didn't find anything. And later on, this happened. So it makes it very difficult to operate, as a legal professional in that environment. Suffice to say that I think the environment has continued to degenerate. Statistics have it right now that in the past few months alone, over 6,000 cases have been documented by the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, of which we are part of. And in those cases, there are about 549 cases of torture, including the 24 that have been mentioned, who participated in the interview, and over 3,086 cases of unlawful arrest. And we would also want to mention that of the cases that individuals have been arrested, the state has never had been able to carry out a successful prosecution in all of those cases. And we have represented since 2003 over 4,500 individuals. And we're very happy to say, possibly as an indicator of how the project that we've been running, there hasn't been a successful conviction, which confirms the point that the law then becomes a tool of persecution rather than prosecution. And excuse of it being a constitutional order when in fact it's not. Then lastly, I think what we might also want to look is the fact that in 2005, the government of Zimbabwe carried out one of the worst operations. All of these things are carried out as operations. If you come up with an economic policy in Zimbabwe, it's an operation. If you come up with a response to HIV and AIDS, it's an operation. All the state institutions, by the way, are now manned by individuals. Either you're a serving brigadier, or you're a retired brigadier, or you're a colonel, something. So you can see the militarization of state institutions. But that's besides the point. They carried out the forced evictions, where over 700,000 individuals, had their houses destroyed. I always sometimes look back and think, what has been the psychological effect of that? It's obviously not visible on your skin that your house has been destroyed, if ever it can tell. But surely in your mind, in your mindset, how it informs you, the dignity, it's like a life without dignity when you're being equated to human waste, because that is what the government called the individuals that they destroyed their houses. Looking at the fact that we're heading for an election in March or in June, assuming it's called in those contexts, what then becomes the role of civil society, the opposition itself? I think it's very challenging, but there are individuals in Zimbabwe, there are organizations who are willing to, return Zimbabwe to a country where it used to be, where there's a rule of law, respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights, where at least we can, live in safety and not in fear that someone is either listening to you, following you, or likely to harm you for expressing different views. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the distinctive things about Zimbabwe is that as you think about the particularly repressive countries in different parts of the world, as you think about Burma, as you think about Uzbekistan and North Korea, other especially repressive countries, Zimbabwe stands out in one respect, and that is that with all of the repression, there are still a significant number of persons in civil society, journalists, physicians, lawyers, leaders of women's groups, and others who have continued to speak out and have never been silent despite the extraordinary level of repression. In a way, that is to me an indication that one can be somewhat hopeful in this respect, that if and when, and it's when, there is a transition in Zimbabwe, there will be a significant number of Zimbabweans who will strive very hard to set the country on a better direction. And one can't be sure that they will succeed, but the very fact that there is that significant segment in Zimbabwe which will push in that direction does give one some reason for hope. But I think we've heard this evening how desperate the situation is today in Zimbabwe. We'd like to bring you in on the discussion.
The impact of torture on the torturer. And the reason this is of interest is because these people ultimately become integrated into society. And their role in society can be rather insidious. Perhaps they're the people that become the wife beaters, or perhaps they're the people that in some way play some other role in society that is a negative one. And it has always struck me, particularly when you point out that a grandmother could be prodded by a grandchild or somebody old enough to be the grandchild. How do young people get their minds turned to become torturers? How do they become people that would do that? And my question to you is there any research into the people who actually commit the tortures, and especially what happens to them later? And one other point about this is just in terms of the medical model, when we talk about intervention, we can talk about intervention in terms of modifying symptoms, which is what we're doing when we take a look really at the effects of torture on the people being tortured. But when we really try to intervene medically, we try to take a look at what the cause is and try to, in some way, intervene with the disease process. And the disease process in this case, I think, has something to do with what is being done to people to allow them to behave in this way toward fellow human beings.
Well, several things, and I want to just touch on the latter part of your question first. The first crucial intervention that must take place in addressing torture, beginning to have some semblance of healing from torture in Zimbabwe, is that it has to stop. That the Zimbabwean government must clearly, unequivocally state that they will not torture, that the international community, particularly the African community, must hold the Zimbabwean government accountable. Because until you have that environment of safety, you're putting Band-Aids on a gaping wound. So that's the first thing that must happen. Then, with regards to your question about, well, how do things like this happen? And unfortunately, we've learned much about this in our own experience here in the United States, from the images of Abu Ghraib, from what we know has happened at Guantanamo and elsewhere. We like to think of torturers as two-headed monsters, but it's not that simple. The scary truth is it's much easier for torture to happen than we'd like to think. And that's why there's such a crucial need for clear, unequivocal bans against torture. The psychological literature is full of experiments which have shown, such as the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram experiments, that individuals who are encouraged by authorities or others and told to do these things will. One, out of a sense of following authoritative rule. Two, out of a sense of dehumanizing and sometimes vilifying the individuals to whom they do this with. And losing a sense of perspective of what they're doing. I don't doubt that there are truly sadistical torturers in Zimbabwe, but I also don't doubt that many of these individuals, and we heard this from a number of the members of civil society we spoke with, that a lot of the members of the police force there feel caught in a double bind of this authoritarian organization, that they're forced to do these things. You allude to a crucial point that clearly the physical and health consequences for its victims are horrific. And by the way, with all of the individuals we examined, they had clear physical and psychological signs of their torture. But I have no doubts in terms of the long-term psychological effect that such brutality has on those who commit this brutality as well.
I basically was going to reiterate the same point. I think one of the interesting things there were how we interviewed one gentleman who had been in the army and fled from the army after being tortured in military prisons for saying, why am I doing this? Because I signed on to be a soldier, not to deface political. It was, they kept getting orders to interfere with political rallies, and anytime he tried to say, this isn't my job, he'd get locked up and beaten and everything else. And so finally fled when he was put at some remote outpost and said, there are many others like me. We did also have specific doctors who came in contact with police who said she felt like a lot of these people weren't bad people, that they didn't feel like they had options, and they were trying to do the best job, least amount of damage they could in a very broken system. Your question is not simple other than that, and I do think the counterpoint to it is that a lot of speculation, but there's thoughts, how did Mugabe end up like this? Is it because he was a victim of torture at some point, and how much does violence just become something that gets into people's heads and way of solving problems? So I think it actually doesn't become, I think the biological treatment is much less important than the political treatment of people saying violence is not okay, and that a society can't tolerate violence as a method of sort of getting things done, because it really does seem to be something that gets passed on and reenacted. So,
is there follow-up research with these people, or is there research actually done in these people?
There's been research done on people who participated in Holocaust era stuff that you can read, that's trying to say, why did people participate? But it tends to be much more an idea of, that there are some antisocial people there, and psychiatry frankly doesn't have good treatment for antisocial people. They end up in prison. But that most things are social disorder, where people aren't given ways of speaking out and speaking the truth, and sort of you end up making these mistakes under the pressures of uniforms and doing what other people are doing and fear. So,
but I'm thinking of something like a follow-up study where you look at, for instance, something like violence within society. The people who commit violent acts in society later, were they previously members of a police organization? Did they have a previous experience doing torture? Are there any studies like, follow-up studies like that? Because that's when we have torture, when we have people in our society committing torture, that's an ultimate consequence on the society that is often not taken into account.
Well, we know, for example, with victims of child abuse, they're much more likely to subsequently commit domestic violence. So clearly there's data out there in terms of violence begetting violence. But the initial solution starts with having a clear ban. A social scientist, Albert Bandura, has written much about what I alluded to, this theory of moral disengagement, where one separates the actions from what they're doing, dehumanizes the individual they're doing this to, and even rationalizes it by that this individual is an enemy of the state, or that we're doing this in the name of the war on terror. And I fear in this sense, President Mugabe has taken a page from some playbooks used here, using that term, the war on terror, of imprisoning and torturing individuals. And when you look worldwide at who's tortured, for the most part, it's always done in the name of, quote, national security, that individuals of the political opposition are seen as enemies of the state and dangers. And so we need a clear ban against that.
When you refer to the victims of child abuse, you remind me of the famous stanza from Auden's poem, September 1, 1939. I and the public know what every school child must learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. And I think we've seen that phenomenon in a great many places. Other questions? Yes.
My name is Alex Kirstevsky. I work here in the communications department at OSI. As Mr. Nair mentioned before, we're webcasting this event, so in the spirit of that, I'd like to read a question that was submitted via the web. The question was submitted by Amanda Atwood of the Kubanara Trust of Zimbabwe and the NGO Network Alliance Project. The question is, the report's recommendations, whilst apt, depend on political will. How do you stop political violence and torture without changed leadership? How do people have the confidence to change the political leadership whilst violence, torture, and intimidation persist?
Akwe, do you want to?
It obviously is not subject to a quick fix, but I would say there are things, one has to have faith that things, you can aggregate political pressure, you can get to individuals who think things should be done differently. I and many of my colleagues in OSI believe that it is possible to get more of a response from African leaders and African politicians. We have seen individuals very tentatively starting to make moves. President Wade of Senegal, President Kufuor of Ghana, a few others, and lower down than that, senior officials. So a challenge for us, perhaps this isn't something that will work inside Zimbabwe, but outside of Zimbabwe, a challenge for us is to try and aggregate, reinforce, persuade those voices in the African political sphere that they have a responsibility, that they do have protocols in their own institutions to which they should be adhering and holding Zimbabwe to a higher standard. And that's the work of advocacy. That's what I do. That's what an awful lot of other people do. And if I thought it didn't ever work, it wouldn't be any point in doing it. So while I absolutely accept that political will is, especially right now in the heart of the beast, as it were, is difficult to see, it doesn't seem to me that one should adhere to a council of despair. One has to believe that things can be done and that it's worth going on pressing for people to do the right thing.
Mr. Saki, do you want to?
Yeah, it's knowing Amanda. Yeah, I would try to hazard to respond, but I think we shouldn't despair, because I know the feeling that has been creeping in so many of us. It's a creeping of the feeling of fatigue that we've been through this, I think, for a number of years. And every other time we tend to post scenarios that, look, it's not going to go beyond this, but, it supersedes that. So suffice to say what Akwe has already mentioned, that I think we really need to, step up our efforts. Already the indications are within the region that, what is happening in Zimbabwe is unacceptable and should come to an end. How, I think, then becomes the challenge. The mediation efforts which have been undertaken in South Africa, I think there's need to induce a sense of accountability, that the mediator, he himself, Thabo Mbeki, is not doing it for Morgan Tsvangirai, Watchman Ncube, and Robert Mugabe, because the three are not Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe doesn't depend on those three. There are so many individuals who are, suffering on a day-to-day because of the political violence that is being unleashed, etc. So we have to, I think, induce a sense of accountability to say beyond them, there should be some measures, assuming that it fails, because they've been, continuously moving the deadlines. Initially, they said the 15th of November. Now I'm told it's the 15th of December when they will actually make, public what their discussions and the resolution that they would have made. Assuming that fails, already Mugabe has said that the international community will not be welcome insofar as elections are concerned. Registration of voters has actually been conducted by institutions which are the very same institutions which rigged the past elections. 2002, Morgan Tsvangirai lost with a margin of about 400,000 voters. And more than 400,000 individuals had been turned away from the polls. More than 400,000 individuals had failed to register. There were ballot boxes which had been stuffed, which are not accounted for. So as things are unfolding, I think they are moving at a much more faster pace than the mediation efforts, are going on. So that would be my short response. Yeah.
Okay, at the microphone. Oh, yeah.
If I could just interrupt with a sort of point of order, if we could ask the guests if they're going to ask follow-up questions to please stay at the mic so that everyone listening in on the web can also hear. Thanks.
If I could just one thing add to the comments that were made, that while yes, President Mugabe clearly, if nothing else, has an advanced degree in violence, the people of Zimbabwe, as evident from Otto, from the other extraordinary individuals I meant, have even higher degrees in resilience. But I believe it will take a concerted international effort needing to be spearheaded by the African community. And I believe that begins with monitoring that probably needed to have started yesterday, monitoring in terms of that free and fair elections are possible, and that the things needed leading up to free and fair elections are in place, including no torture, no intimidation of political leaders.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Les Roberts. I'm an epidemiologist at Columbia University. I guess my question is probably for Otto and Akwe. It seems to me that we just heard Dr. Stewart and Keller gave the political process maybe not a spear and maybe not even an arrow, but at least a very, very sharp dart. 24 well-documented cases, you say, within a population of 500 that's also well-documented. You know, that's better than we've had in North Korea or Burma or lots of other places. How can that be used to alter the trajectory of Zimbabwe now? The biggest distributors of food are American NGOs, and the coercion through food distribution is more severe in Zimbabwe than anywhere I've ever seen. There seems to me there must be things that we could take that information with and leverage, whether it's for fair elections, whether it's for a change in how aid is given. What would you ideally see the use of this report being, please?
Well, thanks, Les. I think for a start, I think this report comes at a very, very important period insofar as the history of Zimbabwe is concerned. But how I foresee its usefulness is the fact that right now we have to work with the UN. I strongly feel that the United Nations has really been a huge disappointment, in my view. Their stance, insofar as Zimbabwe has been concerned, has been now more or less like a hands-off kind of approach. We leave it to the SADC, mediation in the SADC bloc. So what I foresee, I think what I would encourage is possibly, insofar as the leverage of aid is concerned, I'm a little bit reluctant to go that route, because once we advocate for a situation where, for instance, right now the US and the European Union are the major partners insofar as HIV and AIDS is concerned, we are very much aware of that. Like 170 million currently is going for food aid from the US as we speak. 30 million is going to HIV and AIDS. So with the effects, the social effects of possibly suspending the aid or possibly using this report as a leverage to influence what is going to be delivered, I foresee a situation where the humanitarian, catastrophe that will result, because people are starving, even in urban settings, might even far outweigh what we want to achieve, the good that we want to achieve. So it's an issue of how to balance the two, so that at least in the end we don't defeat the efforts that are so much needed presently. But suffice to say that when it comes to political related kind of relationships or assistance that Zimbabwe might be getting, it's very well and right to say, look, insofar as the support that you are receiving possibly for Parliament in terms of the reforms of the laws, we are very much concerned insofar as you have been continuously promulgating repressive laws for the past 5 or so years, one law after the other. So why not possibly, start coming up with pro-human rights related laws? So I think it's a very difficult balance that you would have to strike. But suffice to say that right now what I foresee as an avenue of working is to target the United Nations. They've really been quiet. The special mechanisms within the United Nations on human rights defenders, on freedom of expression, those I think are avenues that we can possibly utilize to say right now is the most opportune time to go in and make statements on what's happening. More so the fact that it's supported by medical evidence. It's something that has not happened in the past to have external individuals who are coming completely devoid of what is happening, completely, I think, independent, if I may use that word, from the environments, because through and through the doctors that have been working in Zimbabwe have been attacked for being part and parcel of the individuals who are calling for regime change. So now this is more or less like an independent expert evaluation of the situation in respect of survivors of torture. it can be used, I think, in that respect.
I would just add that I agree that hard data makes all the difference. So it is wonderful to have this document. And we have just, as a network, boosted our advocacy capacity with a new person in Addis Ababa and East Africa to do advocacy on our behalf around this issue. I and he and other colleagues in Europe will be making sure that this report gets into the hands of senior African leaders and NGOs and officials across the continent to try and boost that awareness that there is solid data here. This is not about a sort of old colonial battle. This is not something that the British did. This is something that's happening here and now at the hands of Zimbabwean officials and paramilitaries, and that they have documents, statutory commitments that Zimbabwe has signed up to, that Zimbabwe's neighbors and the rest of the continent have signed up to, that say this should not happen. And we will be bringing that home loud and clear.
Hi, my name is Terry Ann Hurley.
Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry. It's a distressing issue, so I'm kind of My name is Terry Ann Hurley, and you were mentioning the effects of post-traumatic stress, and I was thinking that possibly the reason why it is difficult for them to get over a lot of their trauma is because, you know, the concept of no safe place to go, as in not even outside of Zimbabwe. And I was doing some reading on this particular country, and it seems that when he first came into power, he was considered to be a hero, you know, a person who was very much, you know, Africa for the African people, not for the Western European powers. He gained a lot of support when he got rid of a lot of Western European land and distributed it to his own people. And I was wondering, which African nations support his efforts, even though it is obvious that his tactics are violent, cruel, and inhumane. But in terms of leadership, you know, the mentality of leadership in Africa, you know, what is their real opinion outside of Zimbabwe? In terms of the ANC, Mandela was tortured by the white regime. He wasn't at the time really tortured by the Africa for African people at the time, which is probably, maybe, and from my limited perspective, the reason why they didn't receive a lot of support from South Africa in terms of you know, their health concerns. And I don't mean to be difficult, but I was wondering what the percentage of white psychiatrists were to the percentage of black psychiatrists that saw the people and investigated their trauma. And I was also wondering whether, my third part of the question is, whether after someone who was white asked these people questions and they made derogatory remarks about the government, whether they were beaten afterwards in the hospital or afterwards because a white person asked them questions, because this person seems to be very against Western European people, period, Western European perspectives. And I was wondering if that's part of his, you know, psychological makeup, where he just punishes people who speak to the Western powers. Thank you.
Those are two fairly separate questions. We were concerned what exactly our role would be as Americans coming in, as white doctors coming in, how useful that would be, if it would immediately mean that Mugabe would dismiss anything that was done or said by us. With regards to we were, for this report and the 24 patients that we spoke about, we were the only two doctors who performed evaluations. The doctors who have been assembling data that the 400 other cases refer to are Zimbabwean, some white Zimbabwean, some black Zimbabwean. The only public psychiatrist in Harare, the one psychiatrist who works for the government hospital, is black, and he said there are a few other private psychiatrists who don't have anything to do with any of this stuff.
We took great pains in terms of doing our best to preserve anonymity, did not actually say who we interviewed where. and aren't going to divulge that information. I will say, again, speaking to the courage of the individuals we spoke to, even we said we would do everything we could to maintain their privacy, but there's no guarantees, and they still agreed for this this document to proceed. One, that yes, we went as white health professionals. As a doctor who has evaluated torture victims from all over the world, I guess I am called, or can be accused of being an equal opportunity documenter, that in the past 2 years I've evaluated a number of individuals who were reportedly, allegedly tortured at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo as well. And so whether they're tortured under this country's watch or under another country's watch, I've documented that and spoken out. And I think, I don't know if Akwe or Otto want to speak to the other components that you asked.
Yeah, well, it's with the African leadership, it's very saddening, I think, to say that they might not have really come up in the open to say, yes, we support him, but they've really been silent in saying, yes, we disagree with what he's doing. So it's not really the saying that, yes, they come out when the 11th March happened, the beatings happened, and say, look, what is happening in Zimbabwe is acceptable. But it's actually their silence which has been of concern. And some of us then draw adverse inference, I think rightly so, to say, if you're silent when this is happening, then what is it that you're actually saying? So the challenge is to unpack this white-black issue, because to me, I don't see it in racial terms. Right now in Zimbabwe, the whites that you call whites are Zimbabweans. Let's take it from the basis that this is a government which has turned into a vampire which is eating up its own, period. The racial dimension only comes out when you want to achieve a certain agenda. And the agenda is to say, we took the land. If we took the land, then why are you still parroting about Blair? He resigned, he left office a long time ago. Why are you still talking about the land as an issue? Fair and fine, we have the land, but is it being productive? It's dead capital. We are starving right now. People are not having enough food because we took the land. So I'll try to unpack it and take it away from it being the rhetoric of the West, because it's not the West which is beating up the people. I didn't see any white person shooting out live ammunition. People were demonstrating. I haven't seen any police officer intimidating or threatening lawyers who is a white person. I haven't seen any actually individual who occupies an influential post being a white person, for that matter. So let's, I think, undo and unpack this and expose them for what they are, because they are really rallying on a sold out point. It's no longer, it doesn't make sense. Sorry.
What percentage of...
Do you want to go?
The percentage of people, it's insignificant. I think if we were to use the statistic that we last had, there were less than 500,000 white Zimbabweans in a population of about 11 million. That's very much insignificant.
I think it's quite a lot less than 500,000 at this stage.
Exactly, because most of them were commercial farmers who have left. So it's far less than 500,000. Yeah.
Just to add, I think you have to try and see this much more, as Otto says, as a political stratagem on the part of the government of Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe in particular. When he says, this is a fight between me and the British, he sets up a situation where if people come out and criticize him, it looks as though they are with the British. And on a continent which has suffered so enormously from the colonial experience, where African unity has been such a critical piece of the attempts to build a bulwark against colonial exploitation, it's asking a lot to have people go against him and stand, as he sets it up, with the British. Even if they're really negligible, they're irrelevant to the present situation. He talks about Western sanctions. The only sanctions that are actually on Zimbabwe at the moment affect individuals in the government, and it stops them from traveling. There is no economic sanction that is interfering with Zimbabwe's economy, and yet across the continent you hear people say, oh, but they've imposed these sanctions. That was a colonial action. Because of the way that the government of Zimbabwe has been so successful at propagating this rhetoric, and because people leap to the conclusion that there must be something to that, because we know the history, we know what the British did in the past. I think it's a big challenge for all of us to try and get these two things separated. We know that history, that's a genuine history, it's a real and legitimate concern that people have, but it does not explain what is happening now.
And just would say, as an outsider observation, there was the collaboration that was happening. You really didn't get a sense of a racial split. You're talking about a different country and different nation when you ask that question. Almost, you don't get that sense. And there was a lot of the human rights advocacy coming from history of people who'd had their land taken because they were white farmers, and then the Maramba Spina, and then there's sort of so many layers that everybody who was working together really was working toward the same sort of political goals, and it felt very collaborative, and you didn't feel that racial question there. I don't think it's prominent there.
Yes.
My name is Danielle Silver, and I'm here with the United Nations Association of the U.S., and we've talked a lot about the failure of African political leadership to a degree to hold Mugabe and the government of Zimbabwe accountable. However, it's my understanding that civil society in surrounding countries, namely in South Africa and Zambia and in Botswana, have been incredibly proactive about creating support networks and relief networks for refugees coming from Zimbabwe. Like COSATU, the labor union in South Africa, has spoken up on behalf of people in Zimbabwe. So I could totally be a misconception, but I'm interested to hear what civil society in these other countries may be doing in order to try and support their neighbors, and what the Open Society Institute and what the United States could be doing to support these kind of grassroots efforts to support refugees or political refugees from Zimbabwe.
Well, I think one of the things, indeed, we really have received support from within the region, within the SADC region itself. But what we, I think, have to look at possibly is to target, the drivers of change in all these efforts. In as far as we have been able to provide safety nets for individuals who are leaving Zimbabwe, either as refugees or asylum seekers to South Africa. The number of individuals who have been granted political asylum in South Africa is negligible in terms of those that are waiting on the backlog. The Ministry of Home Affairs, I think, in South Africa, has got a huge backlog of Zimbabweans who are waiting, to be processed in terms of protection status. And the way they treat Zimbabweans in South Africa itself, it's quite saddening, and it's very, very, very sad to see how they are equally subjected to the very same traumatic conditions that they are running away from. I visited one of the detention centers called Lindela. It's despicable to say the least. You cannot describe the conditions that they are subjected to while they are in there. So in as much as civil society has been able to provide safety nets, provide even with lawyers, I know lawyers for human rights in South Africa have been working around these issues. There's now need to speak to individuals within key influential posts within the receiving countries, so that at least they can start treating us with a little bit of respect. And that being said, there's also another element of the fact that the SADC bloc itself has not really come out clearly on what they think might be the solution beyond the dialogue that is happening. It is one of the blocs that have, I think, in my view, lagged behind because of Zimbabwe. If you're looking at the regional coalitions and the regional formations in Africa, ECOWAS is progressive, very much progressing. When there are issues of disturbance within the West African bloc, they are quick to act and make really a firm and stern intervention. But for Zimbabwe, it has been completely different. So there are countries that need to be targeted, that we share even a history with. Malawi, it might not be as influential as it should be. Zambia itself, the last time that the Zambian president spoke out, he said he compared Zimbabwe to a sinking Titanic, and our president left the summit in a half. He all of a sudden felt very tired, and they said Bob has to leave, or we call him Bob, Robert has to leave. So there are efforts, I think, that really we have to kind of raise the efforts, because there are initiatives, but they might not be as effective as we want to be because of the varying conditions and circumstances in which the countries are operating. Botswana they have been working also with quite a number of Zimbabwean refugees who have resorted to, working there, etc. But the conditions in there are not also as equally receptive, because you want, if a person such as of my stature, forgive me, if I'm to move out of Zimbabwe, for instance, I'd want to continue, making a meaningful contribution to Zimbabwe. But some of them are ending up taking up menial tasks. You have someone who is a teacher, not teaching actually, but working on a farm. And the contribution to the struggle, as it were, from outside becomes very much negligible. So you want to create conditions where an individual as an activist in Zimbabwe is left for safety reasons or conditions for fear of his safety and well-being, is given an opportunity to continue, with the type of work that he's doing, so that at least they can plow back from that and create, an external pressure. So that could be the short response to it.
While it was not the primary focus of our report, we did interview a number of Zimbabwean torture victims in South Africa, and we heard a number of disturbing issues. And clearly it's in the context of a country that, that is wrestling to meet the health needs of its own citizens. But one individual, for example, whom we interviewed, a Zimbabwean victim of torture who was in South Africa, said the following to me, quote, "It's difficult here. It's difficult to find somewhere to sleep. It's difficult to find food. We have no shelter. It's difficult to secure asylum papers. And while you move around, there's a risk the police could arrest you and deport you. If I were sent back to South Africa, I would be butchered." While in Johannesburg, we visited the Methodist church, where we saw literally hundreds of Zimbabweans who would go there to sleep on the floors at night. So clearly a lot more needs to be done. And tragically, unless things are turned around, there will be a lot more individuals who are fleeing because of the political violence in Zimbabwe.
I think just the NGOs that we visited tended to be very scrappy, die-hard, doing whatever they could, but with very little feeling that they were actually communicating with a government that was interested in meeting them on the other end by providing adequate health care, by providing them status, and they had the perception that unless people were provided some kind of status, the general South African on the street was not going to let them into the hospital front door, because they had a sense of, well, these resources are for us. So it seemed like there were people out there trying their best, and again, sort of really scrappy, really grassroots-looking places. So.
And actually, one group that I would mention was a group called the Southern African Women's Institute for Migration Affairs, that really, operating on the most shoestring of budgets, but doing extraordinary work to meet the needs of new refugees arriving in South Africa.
Bill Berkeley.
Yes, I'm Bill Berkeley. I teach human rights reporting at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Amanda Atwood, who submitted the question that you all had so much trouble answering online, is a former student of mine. So I may claim, if I will, full credit for teaching her how to ask such questions. You reminded us, Mr. Saki, of Matabeleland in the 80s, and I actually lived in Matabeleland during that period and worked as a journalist there and spent a lot of time documenting torture. It's now 20 years later, distressing to find out that these problems persist in even greater scale. One of the things I learned then was that the methods of torture being used in Matabeleland in the early and mid-'80s were the same methods that had been used during Ian Smith's campaign. Ian Smith, as we know, just died a couple of weeks ago. So roots in the revolutionary struggle and counterinsurgency campaign in the 70s. In fact, I even interviewed Emerson Mnangagwa in his office in 1985. He was one of the main villains in Matabeleland as head of the Central Intelligence Organization. And as I was interviewing him, an assistant came in to give him some documents. And the assistant was a white man with a brush mustache and powder blue shorts and knee socks. And Mnangagwa introduced him as his former torturer. He was the man who had tortured Mnangagwa in prison in the 70s, and therefore he hired him and turned him loose on his own enemies. Two questions, one psychological and one historical and political. psychological question, we now have basically 40 years of torture at least, and 40 years worth of victims of torture. Have any studies been made with these veteran survivors of torture going back into the 70s and 80s and the long-term psychological and emotional consequences for what are now groups of people of some senior stature? And then the second question is, Bob Mugabe, as we all knew him back then, was widely hailed in the early 80s for his strategy of reconciliation with whites. And there was no Truth Commission, there were no prosecutions of any kind, no thought of accountability. Is one of the lessons that you all have learned in this that was, in hindsight, a misguided, Arya, I'm sure you have thoughts on this, a misguided policy, that some measure of accountability, some strategy for highlighting these abuses and some public forum, that would have been a better strategy if we look at it from the benefit of hindsight?
Why don't you do the first part of that?
We don't know of anything that documents the long-term outcome of the torture. I think what our experience is people said it took them a while to understand they needed to start documenting, and this wasn't just a period of unrest that was going to stop and everyone was going to move on. And so some of the activists who've been documenting since about the 80s said it took a while to get what was going on and that it was going to keep going and that they needed to document. Some of the best documentation that we were able to get a hold of was done by what is now the Solidarity Peace Trust. But there's been so many disruptions in what kind of information can get out of the country that they talked about how difficult it was to even generate that information. And we had that experience again when we were there. There's information in that country that people don't know how to release because they don't know the repercussions. And so there's not, what we're used to in terms of calling it evidence-based, careful reporting. So
the one thing, so while torture is nothing new, and yes, those methods used 20, 40, probably hundreds of years ago still are used. From a medical perspective, in terms of medical documentation, follow-up and treatment, that's fairly new. But as Dr. Stewart alluded to from colleagues such as Solidarity Peace Trust and others, it does appear that this abuse does have long-term health effects. We also know something about this from studies of Holocaust survivors. Anecdotally, from colleagues of mine in South Africa, for example, individuals who are HIV positive who are subsequently tortured, over and over, I kept hearing that they would have a profound decline in their clinical status after having been abused. And this makes sense, that any profound stress on the body, stress on the immune system, will have devastating health consequences. And those health consequences, both short and long term, are in the physical, psychological, and social dimensions.
Slightly off topic, but do want to add, when you say that historical context, I think something that's well established in our understanding of PTSD is that likelihood of having a psychologically traumatic response to torture increases with each episode. So when you're talking about a country where people are exposed again and again in these sort of periods where there's renewed violence, that every time you have another episode and exposure, you're increasing the likelihood that people are going to have a psychologically traumatized response. The first time, there can be the resilience. The second time, there's a little less resilience. So it really does increase, and that's commonly known in terms of rates of PTSD. So.
Okay. We're running out of time. We had said we'd end at 7:30. Elizabeth, do you want to ask a very brief question and get a very brief answer? Okay.
This is another question from the web audience. In post-conflict situations such as Cambodia and Haiti, UN missions have posted observers and medical teams to ensure that prison conditions improve and to prevent some of the poor conditions of detention and abuse that are described in this report. Would you advocate for a similar program in Zimbabwe?
I think,
Yeah, let me take that on. But just on what Bill Berkeley had said, I had the pleasure of reading your report when you still with, I think, Lawyers Committee for Human Rights did that report. I think there's a very huge debate presently in Zimbabwe on what should be the way out. Do we go for prosecutions? I would personally advocate for prosecutions because I'm ready to work in the Ministry of Justice as a prosecutor. Do something much more, effective. And our president, I think, is a ripe candidate for a head of state prosecution. He has done his history of violations through and through. He really created a good dossier. There's irrebuttable evidence of his direct participation, command instructions that they've uttered from as early as 1980 up to now, even going back, assuming we want to go that far. Yes, the UN, that's why we are lamenting, I think, the absence of the UN in all of these instances. We have not even had the present UN mission in Zimbabwe making even a visit to the police stations themselves. They don't even know the conditions of detentions that individuals are subjected to. The UNDP itself, they've got a very well-funded, in my view, human rights-related program, but they're not really participating in these issues. In as far as we would want them to, be proactive and take up, I think, the examples that have been highlighted. They've not been doing that. So that is actually one of the cause of concern to say, yes, there's a mission, there's a UN mission, there's a UNDP in governance-related human rights program, but they're not doing anything, absolutely nothing. In our view, what they've been doing is to buy new vehicles for our judges, which they then use to go to the farms and then be let in courts, and only for lawyers to feel, obliged to buy farm produce from the judges just in case you get a favor. So that's what they've been doing. They've been buying computers for the judges, which are all dusty right now. Not even a single. Most of the judges don't know how to use computers, but that's what they've been doing. So in my view, they really have to do more than that.
Okay. We could continue for a long time. There's a great deal more to be said, but I think we've had a very rich discussion this evening, and I thank the speakers and I thank all of you who attended this evening. And we look forward to the day that Otto Saki is a prosecutor in Zimbabwe and gets a chance to indict some of those who richly deserve to be indicted. Thank you very much.